and someone who was married in this church 22 years ago. Is that right? So if you just give a little wave out, if you get a chance to greet them later on, we're sure glad to have you here. They're here for a graduation this weekend, so thankful to have you here worshiping with us today. If you have a Bible, if you would turn to Revelation, the 21st chapter, right? Very last book of the Bible. We'll be reading from there. Revelation 21, verses 1 through 6. John writes in Revelation 21, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away.' And the one who was seated on the throne said, 'See, I am making all things new.' Also he said, 'Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true.' Then he said to me, 'It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life.'" You notice the songs we're singing today have to do with heaven, and that's the focus of this passage. And there's a story about heaven that a man arrived at the pearly gates, and there he met Peter, who instantly asked the man, "What's your denomination?" And the man said, "Well, I'm Methodist." And Peter said, "Go to room 24, but be very quiet when you pass room number 8. Next came a woman, and Peter asked her the same question, "Denomination?" She said, "I'm Lutheran." He said, "Go to room 11, but again, be very quiet as you pass room 8. Third person arrived, and Peter asked, "Denomination?" And the person said, "I'm Presbyterian." And Peter said, "Go to room 18, but as you pass room 8, be very quiet." Presbyterian was curious and said, "I understand that different denominations may be gathering in different rooms, but why be so quiet by room 8? And Peter said, "Well, that's where the Baptists are, and they think they're the only ones here." You all thought that was true, didn't you? No. If there's one thing I'm coming to understand about heaven and life beyond what we know now, it's that we should picture it. We should talk about it. We should dream about it. We should imagine about it. Not long ago, I was visiting with 2 of my nephews near their bedtime. Young boys, 8 to 10 years or 12 years in age. And their mom had been reading to them from the Bible. And they were stretched out in bed, and they had questions. And so I joined them, and it reminded me of years ago, my own brothers and I, laying in bed talking. And here were some of their questions, like, what race were the first people that God created? Pretty good question, huh? And where did the other races then come from? And then they said, where did the dinosaurs fit in creation? Were they there at the same time of people? Were they there ahead of people? Because Genesis says God created people first. Where did all the different languages come from? Oh, and another question. What age will we be in heaven? Will there be animals there as they looked at their dog laying there beside them? every question led to another question, and I could answer none of them with a specific 2 + 2 = 4 math type of certainty. But that really was okay, because the point wasn't and isn't to get to a direct answer so much as it is for us to think beyond and to wonder. Think of all the books, all the movies that use Revelation as sort of a prediction. You can remember some. I remember as a child with the steep rise of oil prices and gas prices going up, I was taught that for sure the end was near in the mid-70s. And then I was taught that the great bear out of the north was Russia, and maybe, in fact, Gorbachev himself was the Antichrist because he had that mark on his head that surely must have meant he was the one. Most of the books I remember and the predictions that came and the dates, they all went past and have now long passed. And it seems like they were less predictions by prophets and more prediction for profit, if you know what I mean. But regardless, the point was and still is often missed. The point was and is, if you're 12 or you're 52 or you're older than that or anywhere in between, we ought to wonder. We ought to do less figuring out and more simple talking, thinking, dreaming. Revelation 21 is a great place for this. Think ahead, and on those 2 nights of summer that we're sure to have at some point here in Wyoming this year, sit outside some night or go really crazy and lay down in the grass even and look up at the sky and the stars, which you can still see often here, and wonder. For sure, we're called to gain understanding as we go, but even more than that, we should realize that God is really, really big, and there is a lot that we just do not know. And that is okay. Revelation 21, 1-6, and passages like it raise more questions than they do answers, just like my nephews did. They cause us to think. They cause us to think beyond and wonder. And the goal for me, for you today, is that in these minutes, or hopefully in this week and beyond, that you leave this place and you wonder. And you think, and you imagine, and you talk. You talk with friends, you talk with family, and you listen for God. And you wonder about things. It starts right in verse 1. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Well, what does he mean? Heaven and the spiritual realm are sometimes referred to by being the out there of God's abode, but when it's paired with earth, it is meant to be the actual creation of what we know as the earth, the sky, and the stars, and beyond. The space above us. So the vision John starts out with right away in verse 1 is that the first, or the former heaven and earth that God created in Genesis 1:1 will ultimately give way to a new heaven and earth. Fascinating to think about. It's what John sees in his vision. And right away, our minds should start to turn and think, well, will that be a return to perfection of the current earth? Like an exact replica? Will it be transformed like it talks about in Romans 8:19-23? Is that what's going to happen? Or will it be completely destroyed? Like Peter talks about in 2 Peter 3:7. And you can picture things like the Death Star in Star Wars honing in on a planet, and they send that beam and boom, it's gone like in seconds. Is that what we're talking about? What each of us can relate to is not how that's going to happen. John didn't know, we don't know, but we can relate to the concept of new. All of us can relate to that. Graduates today relate especially to that. It's a distinct time of life being new. When Brooke and Cody walk across the stage later on today, they're not just walking across the stage while they're hooping and hollering and throwing their caps up in the air. They're walking into something brand new. All of us sometimes like to go to bed at the end of the day just because it's been a rough day, and we say, I'm going to wake up and start new in the morning. We start a new job. We have a new baby, which I've said it before, but I love hearing the sounds of babies. It's a good thing in this place. New, we have a concept of it. And we notice in Revelation 21, to get to the new, John inserts a phrase that's curious. It says, and the sea was no more. The sea was no more. Now, if you're someone like Josh Schmidt, and you love to fish, and you like to get on the water, you might immediately hear this and say, hey, now wait a minute. What do you mean no more sea, no more water? It's sort of hard to catch a walleye, right, if there's no water. Not a good thing. Keyhole's at an all-time high right now. We don't need to be saying it's gone. So we think about the sea and we say, well, what does John mean? The sea is no more. Genesis 1:1, the sea is a deep void. It's mysterious. It's covered by darkness. It's something that God limits and restricts. And then we start to see water later on. The sea is the place where the Leviathan lurks, and it's sort of dangerous. And then we know, of course, that in the flood, the sea was death to all creatures in Noah's time, save for those that were on the ark. It's what Israel passed through safely, but Pharaoh's army did not. It's where Jonah was tossed and sank down to the bottom with reeds entwined around his head. It's where the disciples thought they would die in the storm because Jesus was sleeping under the deck. Even in baptism, we go under the water, and if we're lucky, the pastor brings us back up to new life. As Bryce said, and I will always remember on Easter, I lived. He survived it. New life. The sea was for John danger and death. So the end of verse 1 exclaims, the sea was no more, death was no more. How often do our hearts cry out for that day? John's vision sees it and pictures it being realized. So I hope you're seeing a picture so far. Everything being made new. Everything being made new with no more danger or death. The reset is hit. The restart button is pushed. And however God brings that about, it's going to happen. And yet, familiar. John recognizes Jerusalem, center of worship in Israel's time, in John's time. He recognizes it coming down out of heaven, and it is beautiful, prepared like a bride for her husband. Last weekend, Mother's Day weekend on Saturday, we visited the site where our son will be married this summer. And we saw a few things we didn't want to see, which Robin can tell you about, but after seeing Sylvan Lake, and if you've been there, you can picture it, after seeing Sylvan Lake and seeing how the wedding would be set up outdoors there, I could picture Eli's fiancée, Lauren, walking the path alongside the lake with every eye trained on her, people rising in honor as she comes around the bend, and her gaze fixed on the one she calls beloved. This is Jerusalem, the bride coming down the aisle, with Jesus' eye fixed right upon her. It's us coming to Jesus in a trembling, exhilarating moment filled with intimacy. Or even better, God coming to us. How many of us really picture heaven and God coming to us? We always think, well, when our time's done here, we go somewhere, but this pictures God coming down to us. The verse says, see, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them, literally tabernacle with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. Now, anybody who claims to be able to fully explain how that will look, what that will be like, is either mistaken or just not speaking truth. God is with us now in spirit. And we know that, don't we? At times when we can sense God's presence, and sometimes it overwhelms us to tears, sometimes it overwhelms us with joy, it brings laughter, sometimes silence. So we know that as believers. But we do not have the capacity to realize what it will be like to have God dwell with us. It heightens every sense within as we try to picture it and envision it. What God promised through the prophets will be realized. Every barrier that has separated us will be finally, ultimately removed. If you think about graduation again today, there will be many tears shed out at Camplex at 1 and then again at 5. Why? Well, they'll be shed because graduation marks an impending separation. Even though students are prepared for it, families are prepared for it, they know it's coming, that separation is difficult when young men and women leave home. It's painful. It's necessary, but it hurts. And it is also a mark of a larger issue. I visited with Cynthia this week, and we talked about the difficulty of loss and of pain and of death and of separation. And we agreed that grief must take its course. You can't take it away from someone. They can't take it away from you. As much as we'd like, we cannot rush through it or get rid of it. This passage says, God will. God will. He will wipe every tear from our eyes. Death will be no more. Would you say that with me this morning? Death will be no more. Let's say it once more. Death will be no more. Let those words stick with you for a few days. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. I can't fathom that. Maybe you can. You might have a better capacity to think of what that will be like. I can't. I can't wrap my mind around what that will be. Think about this. We have not known existence or life apart from death. We have not. None of us has. A big part, in fact, of what I do revolves around death. Hospital visits, funerals. They're sort of my thing. To think that I will not ever again have to watch someone take their final breath. I'll never again hear someone through tears explain how racking the pain is as they miss their spouse. I won't have to hear the indescribable cries of loved ones. Won't have to help dress an infant for her funeral. Won't have to accompany parents to see their teenage son lying lifeless on a table in a mortuary. All of those things you experience in death, you'll never ever experience them again. And it's hard to imagine what that will be like. The pain that's been carried, the tears that have been shed, think about this. They'll be wiped away by God Himself. Can't explain it. I don't think we should try to explain it and figure out all the details about what's going to come. The first things, all the things tainted by evil being gone. The more we try to explain it, I think the worse it makes it. It ruins it in some sense. Just let it be beyond what you can grasp. It's okay. But do think about it and long for it and talk about it, just like young boys as they're getting ready for bed. Don't stop doing that. It's comforting to me to know that as John talks, in all the coming of the new, that the new will be recognizable. Think about this. John recognized the new heaven and earth as heaven and earth. He recognized the new Jerusalem as Jerusalem. They weren't totally foreign to him. He recognized them. So it's kind of comforting to know I won't have 3 heads and tentacles in the new life. And yet I also won't look like John Wayne, which is a little bit disappointing, partner. But you'll know me, I'll know you. We'll be recognizable yet new. In the newness there will be somehow familiarity. God, who brought order to chaos in the beginning, will remove evil when all is said and done, when heaven comes down. And for Josh and any other fishermen or women, there's a word of hope at the end of the passage that says, there is water. There is the spring of the water of life. So there may be fishing yet. Who knows? But it's so easy, isn't it, to be buried by this life in the responsibilities we have, its troubles and its turmoils and everything that goes on. We need to stop. We need to stop sometimes and take time and lift up our heads, lift up our eyes and dream and hope and read and think and pray about the day that is coming. Would you bow your heads this morning, please? Dear God, we thank you for passages like the one we have in Revelation 21 that cause us to think beyond what we know, beyond what we can even imagine, God. But what we hope for, what we long for, what we can sense in our being that we were created for. Of creation being made new. Of there being no more pain, God, that we get so tired of seeing. No more death. And God, what we cannot even begin to describe, you dwelling among us. God, would you help us live and hope and dream and talk and think toward that day? Because it will become reality by your word and your promise. In Christ's name, amen.